The mist rose from the moors like breath from a dying man, curling through the iron gates of Thornwood Hall and settling upon the estate with the weight of 1,000 unspoken sorrows, and in the autumn of 1847 there was perhaps no place in all of England more suited to melancholy than this crumbling monument to a grief that refused to end. The great house stood against the grey October sky like a widow in her weeds, its countless windows darkened, its chimneys cold, save for the few that served the kitchens and the servants' quarters, where life continued in its diminished, whispered way. The gardens that had once been the pride of 3 counties now grew wild and tangled, roses strangled by ivy, pathways lost beneath carpets of fallen leaves that no one bothered to clear, for what was the point of beauty when the master of the house had declared, through his silence and his absence, that beauty itself had died 3 years prior in a blood-stained bedchamber on the 2nd floor. The servants moved through Thornwood Hall like ghosts attending to ghosts, speaking in hushed tones that barely rose above the creaking of ancient floorboards, and when they spoke at all, it was of him, the Duke of Ashworth, Lord Sebastian Blackwood, a man who had once commanded ballrooms and parliaments with equal ease, but who now commanded nothing but the shadows of his own making. He hasn't left the East Wing in a fortnight, the cook would murmur to the scullery maid as they scrubbed pots in the grey morning light, and the scullery maid would cross herself as though the Duke were not a man of flesh and blood, but some spectre trapped between worlds, unable to move forward, unwilling to look back. Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper whose family had served the estate for 4 generations, kept the household running with grim efficiency, but even she had ceased to fight against the darkness that pressed in from every corner. She simply lit fewer candles now, closed more rooms, covered more furniture with white sheets until whole wings of the great house resembled nothing so much as a mausoleum waiting for its final occupant. The late Duchess's portrait still hung in the main gallery, her painted eyes following visitors who no longer came, her smile frozen in a moment before everything shattered, before the son who would have been heir drew his first and last breath in the same terrible instant, before her own heart simply stopped as though it could not bear the weight of such loss. They said the Duke had not spoken her name since the funeral, had not entered her former chambers, had not touched the pianoforte she once played in the music room that now stood locked and silent. They said he drank whiskey in the library until dawn painted the windows grey, and they said, though only in whispers, only when they were certain no one of consequence could hear, that the cold Duke of Ashworth was not cold at all, but rather burning from the inside out, consumed by a fire of guilt and grief that would never be extinguished, that would reduce him to ash long before his body had the mercy to follow. The carriage that brought Miss Eleanor Vance to Thornwood Hall on that grey October afternoon was as worn and weary as the woman who sat within it, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed upon the approaching estate with an expression that mingled dread with desperate hope. For Eleanor Vance, at 24 years of age, had learned that hope was a luxury she could ill afford, and yet she clung to it as a drowning woman clings to driftwood, knowing it may not save her, but unable to release her grip. Her single trunk, battered and leather-bound, contained everything she owned in this world. 3 sensible dresses in dark colours that would not show wear, a handful of books that had survived her father's creditors, her mother's cameo which she had hidden in the lining of her corset when the bailiffs came, and letters of reference that spoke of her education and her character, but carefully omitted the scandal that had driven her from London society like a fox before hounds. She had been Miss Eleanor Vance of Mayfair once, daughter of a gentleman, engaged to a viscount's son who had smiled at her across ballroom floors and whispered promises that turned to ash the moment her father's gambling debts became public knowledge, and then, when breaking the engagement proved insufficient distance, had accused her of improprieties that existed only in his imagination, but destroyed her reputation as thoroughly as if they had been true. Asterisk. "You have nowhere else to go, asterisk," she reminded herself as the carriage wheels crunched upon the gravel drive. Asterisk, "and nowhere is precisely where you shall end if you fail here, asterisk." The house rose before her like something from a Gothic novel, all grey stone and pointed arches and windows that stared down at her arrival with the blank indifference of the dead, and yet Eleanor's intelligent eyes, grey themselves, the colour of storm clouds before rain, saw what others might have missed, the bones of beauty beneath the decay, the elegant proportions hidden by neglect, the possibility of restoration where others saw only ruin. The housekeeper who greeted her at the servants' entrance was a formidable woman of perhaps 50 years, iron-haired and iron-spined, who introduced herself as Mrs. Blackwood and proceeded to deliver a litany of warnings with the same matter-of-fact tone one might use to discuss the weather or the price of flour. The Duke does not wish to be disturbed, does not wish to see the child's governess, and indeed does not wish to acknowledge that the position exists at all, Mrs. Blackwood informed her as she led Eleanor through dim corridors that smelled of dust and dying flowers, and something deeper, something like sorrow made manifest in the very walls. The child herself is difficult. She has not spoken a word in 3 years, refuses instruction, and has driven away 4 governesses before you. The last one fled in the night without even collecting her wages. Eleanor absorbed this information without visible reaction, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. "I am not easily frightened, Mrs. Blackwood," she replied, and her voice was steady even if her hands were not. "And I have nowhere else to go, which, I find, makes one remarkably brave." The nursery wing of Thornwood Hall had been abandoned to silence and shadow. Its cheerful wallpaper of dancing lambs faded to ghosts of their former selves, its toys gathering dust in corners where no child's hand had reached in years, and it was here that Eleanor finally found her charge on the 2nd day of her employment, not in the nursery itself, but in a forgotten sitting room 3 doors down, where Lady Charlotte Blackwood, 7 years old and wild as any creature of the moors, crouched before a portrait of a woman whose painted smile seemed to hold all the warmth that had drained from this house. The child did not acknowledge Eleanor's presence, did not turn or startle or flee, but simply continued her whispered conversation with the canvas, her small voice so soft that Eleanor could catch only fragments, "Mama," and "sorry," and "please come back," words that pierced Eleanor's heart with the precision of a surgeon's blade, for she understood, perhaps better than anyone in this household of adults who had chosen to forget, that grief in a child is not smaller than grief in a grown person, but rather larger, filling every space that should hold joy, crowding out the very air required for living. Eleanor did not speak, did not announce herself with the brisk efficiency the previous governesses had no doubt employed, did not demand attention or obedience or any of the things that adults so often demand of children, as though childhood itself were an inconvenience to be managed rather than a sacred thing to be protected. Instead, she simply lowered herself to the dusty floor beside the child, arranged her worn skirts around her, and sat in silence, her eyes also upon the portrait of the late Duchess, a beautiful woman, Eleanor observed, with Charlotte's same dark curls and something in the set of her mouth that spoke of passion restrained by propriety, a woman who had perhaps never been truly known by anyone, not even the husband who had failed to save her. Minutes passed, perhaps a quarter hour, and still Eleanor did not speak, did not move, simply breathed and waited and offered the only gift she had to give, the understanding that sometimes grief requires company rather than cure, presence rather than platitudes, and that a child who has lost everything needs first to know that she will not be required to pretend the loss away. When Charlotte finally turned to look at her feral eyes in a pale face, tangled hair that had not seen a brush in days, dress stained with evidence of hiding places and neglected meals, Eleanor merely nodded, as one equal to another, as one survivor of storms to another still caught in the tempest. "You may talk to her as long as you like," Eleanor said quietly, her voice carrying no judgment, no instruction, no expectation, "and I shall sit with you, if you'll permit it." Charlotte's eyes widened. Clearly she had expected commands, corrections, the forcing of grief back into its box, and something flickered there. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the first fragile filament of curiosity, the wondering whether this new governess might be different from all who had come before. Outside the forgotten sitting room, Mrs. Blackwood paused in her rounds, observing through the cracked door this unprecedented scene. The new governess, sitting in dust and silence beside the wild child, neither speaking, neither demanding, simply existing together in shared acknowledgement of sorrow, and though the housekeeper shook her head at the unorthodoxy of it, she could not deny that Lady Charlotte had not fled, had not screamed, had not thrown things or bitten or scratched as she had with every governess before. Asterisk. Foolish girl. Asterisk. Mrs. Blackwood thought as she continued on her way. Asterisk, she'll learn soon enough that silence cannot be answered with more silence times. But even as she thought it, Something whispered that perhaps she was wrong, that perhaps this grey-eyed governess understood something about grief that the rest of them had forgotten or had never known at all. It was on the 7th night of her employment that Eleanor first encountered the master of Thornwood Hall, and the circumstances of that meeting would replay in her memory for months afterward. The way the darkness of the library had seemed absolute, until her candle revealed him sitting in a leather chair by the cold hearth, a crystal glass of amber liquid cradled in hands that were elegant and long-fingered and utterly still, as though he had been waiting there for hours, perhaps for years, perhaps for the whole of the 3 years since death had visited his house and made its permanent residence in every shadowed corner. She had come seeking books for Charlotte fairy tales, she had thought, something with magic and hope, something to remind a grieving child that stories could end happily, even when life insisted otherwise, and she had not expected to find anyone in the library at midnight, had believed the Duke to be a phantom spoken of but never seen, a rumor rather than a reality, but here he was made flesh and bone and devastating emptiness, and when he raised his eyes to her candlelight, Eleanor felt the breath leave her body as though it had been struck from her by physical force. He was handsome, she had expected that from the portrait she had seen in the gallery, the one painted before his wife's death that showed a man of perhaps 30 with dark hair and darker eyes, and the proud bearing of his ancient name. But the portrait had not prepared her for the way grief had carved itself into his features, hollowing his cheeks and shadowing his eyes, until he seemed less a living man than a beautiful ghost haunting his own existence. "You are the new governess," he said, and his voice was like the rest of him, cold, distant, empty of anything resembling warmth or interest, and Eleanor understood in that moment that she was nothing to him, less than nothing, a servant whose name he had not bothered to learn, and whose presence registered only as a minor inconvenience to his solitary communion with whiskey and darkness. "Miss Vance, your grace," she replied, and she was proud that her voice did not tremble, though her hand upon the candle did, casting trembling shadows across his aristocratic face. "I came seeking books for Lady Charlotte. I did not mean to disturb you." "Children do not need fairy tales," the Duke said, his tone dismissing not only her request, but the very notion that his daughter might require anything at all. "They are resilient creatures, they survive, they adapt. They do not need coddling by women who imagine that stories can mend what is broken." Eleanor should have curtsied and withdrawn. Every rule of propriety, every instinct of self-preservation demanded it, but something in his words, in the casual cruelty of his dismissal of his own child's suffering, sparked a flame of anger that she could not entirely suppress. "With respect, Your Grace," she heard herself say, "resilience is not the same as healing, and survival is not the same as living. Lady Charlotte may be surviving, but she is not living, and fairy tales may seem foolish to a grown man who has forgotten what it is to hope, but to a child lost in darkness, they can be a candle in the void." The Duke's eyes met hers, then truly met them for the first time, and Eleanor saw something flicker in those depths, something that was not anger at her impertinence, but rather surprise. And beneath that surprise, buried so deep that perhaps he himself did not know it was there, a devastation so complete that it made her earlier assessment seem shallow, and she understood suddenly that his coldness was not cruelty at all but armor, ice built around a wound that had never been permitted to heal, and that the man before her was not living either, was merely existing in the wreckage of a life he had not known how to save. The family solicitor arrived 3 days after Eleanor's midnight encounter with the Duke, a thin and precise man named Mr. Hadwell, whose wire-rimmed spectacles and meticulous ledgers seemed designed to reduce the chaos of human existence into neat columns of figures and obligations, and it was from him, quite by accident, that Eleanor learned the true nature of the shadow that hung over Thornwood Hall, a shadow far more concrete than grief, though grief was certainly its architect. She had been passing through the main hall, Charlotte's small hand clasped in her own, as they returned from a walk in the overgrown garden, where Eleanor had been teaching her the names of autumn flowers, when she heard voices from the Duke's study, the door left carelessly ajar by a footman who had not thought to check for listening ears. And though Eleanor knew she should walk on, should pretend she had heard nothing, something in the solicitor's tone urgent, pleading, desperate in a way that seemed at odds with his precise demeanor made her pause, made her listen, made her understand at last why this house felt not merely frozen in mourning, but paralyzed by some impending doom. "Your Grace must understand," Mr. Hadwell was saying, his voice carrying clearly into the hall. "The terms of the trust are absolute. Your grandfather established them after the scandal with your great-uncle, and they cannot be altered by any power in England. The Duke of Ashworth must produce a legitimate male heir within 5 years of ascending to the title, or the entirety of the unentailed estate passes to the next male relative, and that, Your Grace, means your cousin, Lord Marcus Blackwood, a man whose character I need not describe to you, for you know as well as I do what he is." The Duke's reply was cold, clipped, empty of anything resembling hope. "Then let him have it. Let him have the paintings and the silver and the cursed house that killed my wife. I will not marry again, Hadwell. I will not stand before God and make vows I cannot keep to another woman I cannot love. But your Grace," the solicitor pressed, and Eleanor could hear the shuffle of papers, the rustle of desperate documentation. "It is not only the estate at stake, Lady Charlotte. Your daughter, she will be left entirely dependent on Lord Marcus's charity, and he has made no secret of his intention to send her away, to forget she exists, to enough." The Duke's voice was ice and fire combined, the first genuine emotion Eleanor had heard from him, and she felt Charlotte's hand tighten in her own, as though the child somehow sensed the danger being spoken of just beyond those walls. "I am aware of the stakes, Hadwell. Do you imagine I do not lie awake calculating the cost of my own failure? But I cannot conjure a wife from thin air, cannot manufacture feelings that died with—" He stopped, and in that silence, Eleanor heard everything. The wife who had died in childbed 3 years ago, the stillborn son who would have solved everything, the guilt and grief that had frozen this man into a monument of his own making, and beneath it all, the terrible truth that Lady Charlotte's entire future hung upon her father's willingness to do what he had sworn never to do again. Eleanor moved away then, drawing Charlotte with her toward the garden once more, but her mind was churning with the implications of what she had heard. The cruel cousin waiting in the wings, the daughter who would be cast aside like an inconvenient reminder of tragedy, the father who was so lost in his own guilt that he could not see how his inaction was its own form of destruction. And she looked down at the silent child beside her, this small, fierce creature who had already lost so much, and felt something harden in her chest, a resolve that had nothing to do with her position and everything to do with the growing certainty that she would not, could not, allow this broken family to shatter completely, even if she had no right to care, even if caring was the most dangerous thing she could possibly do. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Eleanor had not dared to hope for, a pattern of small victories and quiet moments that accumulated like autumn leaves upon the ground, each one seemingly insignificant on its own, but together forming something substantial, something that spoke of progress, even when progress seemed impossible. She established routines with Charlotte that honored the child's need for predictability, while gently expanding the boundaries of her world. Lessons conducted by the tall windows of the schoolroom where pale October light filtered through glass that had not been properly cleaned in years, stories read before bed from the fairy tale books that had mysteriously appeared in the nursery one morning without explanation or acknowledgement. Slow walks through the overgrown garden where Eleanor taught Charlotte the names of the flowers that still struggled to bloom despite the neglect that surrounded them. And though the child still did not speak, her silence had shifted in quality from something hostile and defensive to something more like listening, like waiting, like a door that had been locked for so long that it had forgotten how to open but was perhaps, just perhaps, beginning to remember. Eleanor kept a journal of her observations, recording each small gesture that seemed to indicate progress, the way Charlotte had reached for her hand during a particularly loud thunderstorm, the manner in which she had begun to sit closer during their reading sessions, the first tentative smile that had flickered across her face when Eleanor had made a deliberately silly voice for the villain in a story, and she found herself writing with increasing frequency about the Duke as well, about the ways in which he seemed to hover at the edges of their existence, watching from windows that he thought concealed him, retreating the moment Eleanor's eyes lifted to find him there, a ghost in his own house, who could not quite bring himself to haunt the rooms where his daughter and her governess were slowly building something from the ruins of his abandonment. She learned to recognize the signs of his distant attention, the request she had submitted for new educational materials approved without comment, the standing order changed so that Charlotte might take her breakfast in the sunny morning room rather than the cold isolation of the nursery. the fire that now burned reliably in the schoolroom each morning, though no servant would admit to lighting it, and Eleanor began to understand that the Duke was not as absent as he wished to appear, that somewhere beneath the ice and the whiskey and the determination to feel nothing at all, a father still existed who could not entirely ignore his daughter's existence, even if he could not bring himself to participate in it. She told herself that these small gestures meant nothing, that they were merely the practical decisions of a man managing his household, but late at night, when she could not sleep, when she lay in her narrow bed in the servants' wing and listened to the wind howl against the old stones of Thornwood Hall, she allowed herself to wonder if perhaps, the cold Duke was watching not only his daughter's transformation, but her own presence in this house, and that thought, dangerous as it was, settled into her chest like an ember that refused to die. Sebastian Blackwood, the Duke of Ashworth, stood at the window of his study and watched the governess lead his daughter through the autumn garden, and he hated himself for watching, hated the way his eyes sought out the particular shade of Eleanor Vance's auburn hair against the grey October sky, hated the manner in which his chest constricted when he saw Charlotte reach up to take her hand with the easy trust of a child who has finally found something solid to hold on to in a world that has proven itself treacherous. He had not asked for this awareness, had not invited this slow erosion of the walls he had so carefully constructed, and yet here he stood, day after day, finding reasons to position himself near windows that overlooked whatever corner of the estate the governess and his daughter had chosen to inhabit, telling himself that he was merely overseeing his household, merely ensuring that his money was being well spent on this latest in a long line of women who had attempted and failed to reach Charlotte. But the lie tasted bitter, even in his own mind, because he knew, God help him, he knew that what drew his gaze was not paternal concern but something far more dangerous, something that had no place in the frozen landscape of his heart. He noticed things about her that no employer should notice about a servant, the intelligence that sharpened her features when she was thinking, the patience that seemed to emanate from her very being when Charlotte retreated into silence, the way she treated his daughter not as a problem to be solved or a burden to be endured, but as a person deserving of respect and gentleness and time. And he found himself listening for her footsteps in the corridors, found himself irritated when a day passed without some glimpse of her, found himself reading and rereading the requests she submitted for Charlotte's education, as though her handwriting itself contained secrets he needed to decipher. The recognition of his own interest filled him with something close to rage, because he had decided 3 years ago that he was finished with feeling, finished with the vulnerability that came from caring about another human being, finished with the particular agony of watching someone you were supposed to protect suffer because of your own inadequacy. Times Marguerite's face surfaced in his memory then, pale against the blood-soaked sheets, her eyes holding accusation even as the life drained from them, and he heard again the terrible silence that had followed the physician's announcement that the child, the son, the heir who might have saved them all, had never drawn breath times, and he turned from the window with a violence that startled even himself, crossing to the cabinet where he kept the whiskey, pouring a measure that was larger than it should be at this hour of the afternoon, drinking it down as though the burn in his throat could cauterize whatever was beginning to grow in the spaces he had thought permanently scarred. He told himself that Miss Vance was merely competent, merely doing the job he paid her to do, told himself that his interest was nothing more than the natural response of a lonely man to the presence of a young woman in his household, told himself that the governess meant nothing, that she would leave like all the others, that he would remain as he was, frozen and safe and dead to everything that might hurt him. But even as he poured another drink, he knew that something fundamental had shifted, that Eleanor Vance had slipped beneath his defences without his permission, and that the cold Duke of Ashworth was beginning, against every intention, to burn. The storm arrived without warning on an evening in late October, a tempest of such ferocity that the old servants crossed themselves and whispered of omens, while the wind howled against Thornwood Hall like a living thing, demanding entry. Eleanor had been reading to Charlotte in the nursery when the first crack of thunder shook the windows, and within the hour Mrs. Blackwood appeared at the door with a candle guttering in her hand, and news that the servants' wing had flooded, that the old drainage channels had finally given way under the onslaught of rain, and that Miss Vance would need to spend the night in the main house, in the guest chamber at the end of the family corridor. And Eleanor felt her stomach tighten at the implications, even as she nodded her acceptance and gathered Charlotte close against the child's fear of the storm. The guest chamber was grander than anywhere Eleanor had ever slept, with heavy velvet drapes and a four-poster bed that seemed designed for someone far more important than a governess, but she had little time to contemplate its elegance before a footman appeared to inform her that His Grace expected her presence at dinner, that with the storm making normal household operations impossible, the Duke had decreed that Miss Vance and Lady Charlotte would dine with him in the small dining room rather than taking trays in their respective quarters. The meal that followed existed in Eleanor's memory ever afterward. As an exercise in exquisite discomfort, she sat across from the Duke with Charlotte between them, like a small, silent buffer, the candlelight casting shadows across his angular features, while rain lashed the windows and thunder rolled across the moors, and their conversation moved in fits and starts, strained attempts at propriety that kept stumbling over the strange intimacy of their circumstances. He asked about Charlotte's progress, and Eleanor answered carefully, professionally, but their eyes kept meeting across the table in ways that had nothing to do with the child between them, and Eleanor found herself noticing the way his hands wrapped around his wine-glass, the way his jaw tightened when lightning illuminated the room, the way he watched her speak with an intensity that made her forget the words she had intended to say. Charlotte, exhausted by the excitement and fear of the storm, began to droop over her pudding, her small head nodding toward the table, and Eleanor moved to lift her, but the Duke was faster, rising from his chair with a fluidity that surprised her and gathering his daughter into his arms with a tenderness that stopped Eleanor's breath in her throat. She watched him cradle Charlotte against his chest, watched him press his lips briefly to her hair, watched the ice in his expression melt into something raw and aching and desperately paternal, and she understood in that moment that the cold Duke of Ashworth was not cold at all, but rather a man who had locked his heart away because he could not bear the weight of his own capacity for love. He carried Charlotte from the room without looking back, but Eleanor remained frozen at the table, her hand pressed to her chest where something dangerous had begun to bloom, and she knew with terrible certainty that she was in far greater peril than any storm could pose, for she had glimpsed the father buried beneath the frost, and that glimpse had changed everything she thought she understood about this house, this man, and her own treacherous heart. The scream that shattered the silence of Thornwood Hall at 3 o'clock in the morning was small and high and desperate, and Eleanor was running before she was fully awake, her bare feet cold against the stone floors, her nightgown streaming behind her as she flew down the corridor toward Charlotte's room, with her heart pounding against her ribs and a prayer on her lips. She burst through the door to find the child thrashing in her bed, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, her small face contorted with terror as she fought against nightmares that Eleanor could not see but could imagine all too well. And she gathered Charlotte into her arms without hesitation, pulling the trembling body against her chest and rocking, murmuring nonsense words of comfort into hair that smelled of lavender and fear. And then it happened, the moment that would divide Eleanor's time at Thornwood Hall into before and after. Charlotte's eyes flew open, wild and unseeing at first, and her mouth formed a word, a single word that emerged hoarse and broken from a throat that had not produced speech in 3 years, and that word was Miss Vance, spoken like a talisman against the dark, like a rope thrown to a drowning child, like the first crack in ice that has held too long. Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes, even as she tightened her embrace, even as she whispered, I'm here, you're safe." And Charlotte clung to her with desperate strength, and Eleanor became aware of another presence in the doorway, a tall figure in a dressing gown who stood utterly still, as though turned to stone by what he had witnessed. The Duke of Ashworth's face in the flickering candlelight was a study in devastation, his composure shattered so completely that Eleanor could see every emotion he had spent 3 years suppressing, the grief, the guilt, the desperate love he had been too afraid to express, the agony of a father who had watched his daughter retreat into silence and blamed himself for every wordless day. His eyes were wet, she saw that clearly, saw the way the candlelight caught the moisture on his cheeks, saw the way his hands trembled at his sides as though he wanted to reach for his daughter but had forgotten how, as though he feared that his touch might somehow undo this miracle, might send Charlotte spiraling back into the prison of her own making. "She spoke," he said, and his voice cracked on the words, and Eleanor understood that she was witnessing something far more intimate than she had any right to see, the breaking of a man who had believed himself already broken beyond repair. Charlotte had quieted in Eleanor's arms, her breathing evening out, but her small fingers remained tangled in Eleanor's nightgown as though she feared being released, and Eleanor made a decision that propriety would have forbidden, that her station should have prevented, but that her heart demanded. Nonetheless, she looked at the Duke, standing frozen in the doorway, and she said, softly, "Come in," and after a moment of hesitation that seemed to last an eternity, he did, crossing the room on silent feet to lower himself onto the opposite side of Charlotte's small bed, and the three of them existed together in the darkness, in the sacred space that grief and hope had carved out of the night, and no one spoke again because words were unnecessary, because Charlotte's single utterance had said everything that needed saying, and Eleanor watched the Duke reach out with infinite care to touch his daughter's hair, watched Charlotte shift in her sleep to lean toward his hand, watched something begin to heal in the grey light of approaching dawn that filtered through the curtains like a promise, and she knew that whatever happened next, whatever propriety demanded or society decreed, this moment had bound the three of them together in ways that could never be fully undone. The days that followed Charlotte's first word existed in a strange suspension, as though the household held its collective breath, waiting to see what would emerge from the chrysalis that single utterance had created. And Eleanor found herself drawn into the Duke's orbit. With increasing frequency, he began appearing during Charlotte's lessons, standing in doorways with the pretense of passing through, asking questions about his daughter's progress that required longer answers than necessary. And Eleanor would feel his gaze upon her as she guided Charlotte's small hand across the pages of her copybook, would sense the weight of his attention like sunlight through glass, warming her even as she reminded herself that such warmth was dangerous, that she was a governess and he was a duke, and the gulf between them was wider than the moors that surrounded Thornwood Hall. Their conversations deepened imperceptibly, moving from Charlotte's studies to books they had both read, to opinions on matters that employers rarely discussed with servants, and Eleanor discovered that the cold Duke possessed a mind as sharp as cut crystal, that beneath his frost lay thoughts and observations that matched her own, that challenged her, that made her forget for perilous moments that she had no right to feel the flutter in her chest when he leaned closer to examine Charlotte's drawings, or when his rare half-smile appeared like sun breaking through November clouds. She began to care too much. She recognized the symptoms with the clinical detachment of one who has learned to guard her heart through hard experience. And at night, in her narrow bed, in the servants' wing, she would press her hands to her face and remind herself of everything she had to lose, of the scandal she had already survived, of the impossibility of a future that her foolish heart had begun to paint in colors it had no business using. The moment came without warning on an afternoon when autumn light slanted through the library windows like honey, when Eleanor reached for a volume of poetry on a high shelf. At the precise instant the Duke reached for the same, and their fingers brushed in the golden dust motes, and the shock that traveled through Eleanor's body was electric, immediate, devastating. She saw her own startled recognition reflected in his grey eyes, saw the way his breath caught, saw something raw and hungry flash across his features before he withdrew his hand as though burned and stepped backward, his expression closing like a door slammed shut against winter wind, and when he spoke, his voice had returned to ice. "I believe you have lessons to prepare, Miss Vance," and Eleanor understood with painful clarity that he was afraid, that he had felt what she felt and it terrified him, and she murmured, "Yes, Your Grace," and fled the library with her heart pounding and her hands trembling, and the ghost of his touch burning against her skin. He avoided her for a week afterward, taking meals in his study, disappearing when she entered rooms, and the servants began to whisper she heard them when they thought she couldn't, heard Mrs. Blackwood chastising a housemaid for gossip about heirs above her station and forgetting her place. And Eleanor bore it all in silence, building her own walls higher, telling herself that distance was safety, that she had survived worse, that she would survive this too, even as something fragile and newly wakened within her curled inward like a frost-touched bloom, waiting for a warmth that propriety forbade her to seek. The carriages arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, when the sky hung low and grey with the promise of early winter, and Eleanor watched from the schoolroom window as a parade of wealth and privilege descended upon Thornwood Hall, 4 coaches bearing guests for what Mrs. Blackwood had grimly informed her was a house party arranged by the solicitor to remind his grace of his duties, and among them, stepping from the finest carriage with the practised grace of one born to be observed, was Lady Arabella Fontaine, and Eleanor knew instantly, with the instinct of a woman who has learned to recognize her own inadequacies, that this creature of silk and diamonds and impeccable breeding had been brought here for a singular purpose. Lady Arabella was everything Eleanor was not, tall where Eleanor was merely average, golden where Eleanor was brown, titled where Eleanor was nobody, and possessed of a cold, crystalline beauty that drew every eye in any room. She entered. Eleanor learned these facts over the following days as the household transformed around the guests, as servants scurried to prepare elaborate meals, and the Duke was forced from his solitude into the drawing-room each evening, and she watched from the shadows of her station as Lady Arabella laid siege to Thornwood Hall with calculated charm, laughing at the Duke's rare comments, touching his arm with proprietary familiarity, speaking of mutual acquaintances and shared social circles that reminded everyone present exactly where a governess belonged in the hierarchy of things. Charlotte felt it too. The child, who had begun to bloom under Eleanor's care, seemed to wilt in the presence of these strangers, and when Lady Arabella bent to address her with a smile that never reached her eyes, saying, "What a pretty little thing! Though terribly shy, we shall have to cure you of that," Charlotte pressed herself against Eleanor's skirts and would not be moved, and Eleanor saw something flicker across Lady Arabella's perfect features, something hard and dismissive, before she turned away as though the child had ceased to exist. The Duke watched this exchange. Eleanor felt his gaze from across the room, felt the weight of his attention as Lady Arabella claimed his arm to lead him into dinner, and his expression was unreadable, a mask of aristocratic politeness that revealed nothing of the man who had sat beside his daughter's bed through the long watches of the night, nothing of the father who was learning to reach through his own walls, and Eleanor told herself that the ache in her chest was merely professional concern, merely worry for Charlotte, who needed stability and gentleness, and not a stepmother who looked at her as though she were an inconvenience to be managed. But alone in her room that night, listening to the distant sounds of laughter from the drawing-room below, Eleanor pressed her face into her pillow and admitted the truth that propriety had forbidden her to speak. She was jealous, savagely and completely jealous, of a woman who had every right to want what Eleanor had no right to dream of, and the admission burned like shame, even as it clarified everything she had been trying not to feel since that moment in the library when the Duke's fingers had brushed hers and the world had tilted on its axis. The words reached Eleanor through the half-open door of the morning-room, where she had paused to retrieve Charlotte's forgotten shawl, and they struck her with the force of a physical blow, Lady Arabella's voice, crystalline and cruel, carrying clearly to where Eleanor stood frozen in the corridor. "The child is quite impossible. Of course, damaged goods, one might say, after 3 years of running wild with no proper guidance, but these things can be managed once I am mistress here, a good boarding school in Switzerland perhaps, somewhere distant where her peculiarities won't reflect poorly on the family, and Sebastian needn't be troubled with the details once the heir is secured." And Eleanor's hand tightened on the doorframe as Lady Arabella's companion murmured something sympathetic about the burdens of stepmotherhood, and Lady Arabella laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Burden implies, I intend to bear it. No, the girl will be sent away before the wedding flowers wilt, mark my words, and that governess, with her presumptuous airs, will follow shortly, after I've seen the way she looks at him, as though a woman of her station could ever." But Eleanor heard no more because she was fleeing through corridors that blurred through sudden tears, fleeing past startled servants, and through the garden door into the bitter evening air, where the first true cold of approaching winter cut through her thin dress like a blade. She wept in the garden, among the roses that Eleanor and Charlotte had been coaxing back to life, wept with a fury that frightened her, because it was not for herself she had survived worse, had learned to armor her heart against cruelty, but for Charlotte, for that fragile child who had only just begun to speak again, who trusted so few people in this world, who would be torn from everything familiar and sent away to strangers by a woman who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience to be discarded. The footsteps on the gravel path made her scrub frantically at her face, but there was no hiding the evidence of her tears. When the Duke rounded the hedge and stopped short at the sight of her, she saw his expression shift from surprise to something darker, something almost dangerous, as he took in her reddened eyes, her shaking hands, the distress she could not conceal, no matter how desperately she tried. "Miss Vance," he said, and his voice was careful, controlled, but beneath the ice she heard something that made her breath catch. "You will tell me what has happened, you will tell me now." And perhaps it was the cold, or the shock, or the simple exhaustion of maintaining walls that had grown too heavy to bear, but Eleanor told him, the words spilling out in a tumble of grief and anger, what she had heard, what Lady Arabella planned for Charlotte, the casual cruelty with which she had spoken of sending a wounded child away like an unwanted package. The transformation that overtook the Duke's features was terrifying in its completeness. The mask of aristocratic indifference shattered, and in its place emerged something ancient and primal, a father's rage burning cold as the winter stars, and when he spoke his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "No one speaks of my daughter that way, no one threatens her place in this house, no one." He looked at Eleanor then, truly looked at her, and she saw in his grey eyes not the cold Duke but the man beneath, the father who had sat beside his daughter's bed through nightmares, the protector who had been waiting to emerge, and something passed between them in that frozen garden, an understanding, a recognition, a shared devotion to a child they both loved, and Eleanor knew with devastating certainty that she had lost her heart entirely to a man she could never have, even as his gaze held hers with an intensity that suggested perhaps, impossibly, he had lost his heart too. The library found them again that night, as though the room itself conspired to draw them together. Eleanor had gone seeking solace among the books, unable to sleep with the memory of his eyes burning through her thoughts, and she discovered she was not alone when she rounded the towering shelf of philosophy texts and found him standing at the window, silhouetted against the frost-touched glass, and he did not turn when she gasped, but spoke into the darkness as though he had been waiting for her, as though he had known she would come. "She is gone. Lady Arabella departed this evening with her companions, and I find myself standing here wondering how I became a man who would consider, even for a moment, binding himself to such cruelty for the sake of duty." Eleanor knew she should withdraw, should maintain the careful boundaries that protected them both, but her feet carried her forward until she stood beside him at the window, close enough to see the way moonlight carved shadows beneath his eyes, close enough to hear the unsteadiness of his breath, and she said nothing, because sometimes silence was the only gift one could offer, a soul preparing to unburden itself. "My wife died hating me," he said, and the words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything Eleanor thought she understood. She was beautiful and accomplished and everything a duchess should be, and I married her because my father demanded it, because duty demanded it, because I had been taught that personal feeling was weakness, and a man of my station must think only of legacy and lineage, and she knew. Eleanor. She knew from our wedding night that I could not love her, that I had built walls so high and so thick that nothing could reach me, and she spent 5 years beating herself bloody against those walls before she finally surrendered. He turned to her then, and his grey eyes held such devastation that Eleanor's heart cracked along fault lines she had not known existed, and he continued in that terrible quiet voice. When she told me she was with child again, after Charlotte, I saw hope in her eyes, hope that perhaps a son would finally make me love her, and I could give her nothing, nothing but cold courtesy and distant respect, and she died bringing forth a child that never drew breath, and her last words to me were, "I hope you freeze alone in this tomb you've made." The sob that escaped Eleanor's throat was involuntary, born of grief for a woman she had never known, and for the man who had carried this guilt like chains for 3 years, and she reached for him without thinking, not to embrace, but simply to rest her fingers against his sleeve, a touch so light it might have been imagined, and he looked down at her hand as though it were something miraculous, something impossible. "I believed her," he whispered. "I believed I deserved to freeze, that I was incapable of warmth, that Charlotte was better off with my distance than my fumbling attempts at fatherhood, until you came to this house with your worn trunk and your fierce heart, and your absolute refusal to let either of us remain frozen." He captured her hand, then, pressing it between both of his own, and his skin was warm, so warm, nothing like the ice she had expected. "You are the first person in 3 years who has made this house feel alive, Eleanor, and I find myself burning where I thought there was nothing left but ash." He did not kiss her, did not cross the final boundary that honor demanded they maintain, but his forehead dropped to rest against hers, and they stood there in the moonlit library, breathing the same air, trembling on the edge of everything, and Eleanor understood that whatever happened next, neither of them would ever be the same. The dinner party that Lady Arabella had insisted upon hosting despite her departure being demanded, she had convinced the remaining guests that one final evening of civilized entertainment was owed to them, became the stage for Eleanor's complete undoing, and she should have recognized the danger in the way Lady Arabella's eyes glittered with barely concealed triumph. When Eleanor entered the dining room to retrieve Charlotte's forgotten medicine, should have fled when those painted lips curved into a smile that held no warmth whatsoever, but instead she stood paralyzed as Lady Arabella rose from her chair and addressed the assembled guests with the theatrical precision of an executioner. "How fortunate that Miss Vance has joined us. I had so hoped to share the fascinating intelligence I received today from London, for it seems our dear governess has been keeping secrets, and I do believe the Duke deserves to know exactly what manner of woman he has allowed such intimate access to his daughter." The silence that fell over the table was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the wild drumming of Eleanor's heart, and she watched in frozen horror as Lady Arabella produced a letter from her sleeve, brandishing it like a weapon. "It appears Miss Vance is the daughter of the infamous Harold Vance, whose gambling debts scandalized half of London before he fled to the continent to escape his creditors. But that is merely the prologue to our tale, for the truly delicious portion concerns Miss Vance's broken engagement to the Honourable Frederick Ashton, who was forced to withdraw his offer when he discovered her in a compromising position with his own cousin." Gasps rippled through the guests, and Eleanor's voice emerged, strangled, desperate. "That is not I was, not he, fabricated those accusations to escape a marriage he no longer wanted when a wealthier prospect emerged." But Lady Arabella spoke over her with poisonous sweetness. "Of course you would claim such innocence, but Mr. Ashton's letter was quite explicit about the impropriety he witnessed, and I must say, it does explain the particular talent Miss Vance seems to have for insinuating herself into the affections of wealthy, vulnerable men." Every eye in the room turned to Eleanor, and she saw in their faces the judgment she had fled London to escape the assumption of guilt, the eager appetite for scandal, the complete unwillingness to consider that a woman of her station might be telling the truth, and she could not look at the Duke, could not bear to see the same condemnation in his grey eyes, so she did not see that he had gone utterly still, his face a mask carved from marble, his silence stretching on, as Lady Arabella continued her poisonous recitation of every rumour, every whispered shame, every detail of Eleanor's ruined reputation, and when Eleanor finally found the courage to lift her gaze to his, she saw only that terrible stillness, that impenetrable silence, and she understood, or believed she understood, that everything between them had been a dream from which she had now been forced to wake, that no Duke could associate himself with such scandal, that the confession in the library had been nothing more than a moment of weakness he now surely regretted, and so Eleanor did the only thing her shattered dignity would allow. She gathered the remnants of her composure like armor, turned without a word, and walked from the dining room with her spine straight and her heart in ruins, climbing the stairs to her small chamber, where she pulled her worn trunk from beneath the bed and began, with trembling hands, to pack away the fragments of a life that had briefly seemed possible before being exposed as the foolish fantasy it had always been. The door to her chamber flew open without ceremony, and Eleanor did not need to turn from her packing to know who stood upon the threshold. She could feel his presence like a change in the very atmosphere, like the moment before lightning strikes when the air grows thick and charged with something inevitable, but she could not bear to face him, could not endure the words of dismissal that must surely follow. So she continued, folding her meagre garments, with hands that shook so violently the fabric slipped repeatedly through her fingers, and she spoke before he could, her voice emerging fractured and strange. "Please do not trouble yourself. Your Grace, I shall be gone before morning, and you need not concern yourself with explanations or severance. I want nothing but to leave with what little dignity Lady Arabella has left me." But her desperate speech was interrupted by the sound of the door closing firmly behind him, by his footsteps crossing the worn carpet, by his voice cutting through her protests with a single word, "Stop." She stopped, though she still could not turn, still could not look upon his face and see the contempt that must surely reside there. But then his hands were upon her shoulders, gentle as they turned her toward him, And what she saw in his grey eyes was not disgust or disappointment or the cold dismissal she had steeled herself to receive, but something that looked remarkably, impossibly, like tenderness. "Did you imagine," he said quietly, "that I would condemn you for the sins of your father, for the lies of a coward who would rather destroy a woman's reputation than honor his promises? Did you truly believe me, capable of such cruelty? After everything we have shared in this house?" Eleanor's tears fell freely now, beyond any hope of control. "You were silent in the dining room. When she said those things, you said nothing," and her voice broke upon the word, all her terror and shame pouring forth in that single accusation, and she watched something like pain flicker across his features before he answered. "I was silent because I was deciding whether to destroy her with words or simply have her removed bodily from my home. I chose the latter, though I confess I now regret not doing both." His hands rose to cup her face, thumbs brushing away her tears with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a man who had been carved from ice for so long. "Eleanor, I have known about your past for weeks. I had you investigated the moment I realized that my interest in you had become something far more dangerous than mere curiosity, because I needed to understand what forces had shaped the woman who was systematically dismantling every wall I had built around my heart." She stared at him, unable to comprehend. "You knew and you still," and he silenced her with a sound that might have been a laugh in a man less damaged. "I knew that you were slandered by a faithless man, abandoned by a feckless father, and left to make your way in a world that offers women of your position no mercy. And I knew that despite all of this, you arrived at my door with courage enough to face a household of ghosts, patience enough to heal my broken daughter, and compassion enough to see past my frozen exterior to the man dying beneath. How could I condemn you for having suffered when your suffering made you capable of saving us?" The word hung between them, that small word that contained everything us and Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been locked away since the night Frederick Ashton's lies had destroyed her life. "I love you," Sebastian said, and the words seemed to cost him something, seemed to require the demolition of the very last barrier he possessed. "I love you, Eleanor Vance, and I am asking you not as a duke to a governess, not as a master to a servant, but as a man who has been dead for 3 years and feels himself finally breathing again. Would you consider becoming my duchess, my partner, my heart?" Eleanor reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that grief had carved there, feeling the warmth that had replaced the cold. Only if a duke could accept being loved by someone who has nothing to offer, but herself, no fortune, no title, no connections that would not bring shame, and he caught her hand, pressed his lips to her palm. "You offer everything. You offer a home for my daughter, a future for my heart, a chance to become the man I should have been all along, Eleanor. You offer me redemption." When he kissed her, finally, there in her small servant's chamber surrounded by the scattered evidence of her almost departure, Eleanor understood that some stories do not end in tragedy, that sometimes, against all reason and expectation, love finds its way through the cracks in our armor and refuses to let us freeze alone. The announcement of the engagement between Sebastian Blackwood, Duke of Ashworth, and Miss Eleanor Vance, Governess, detonated through London society like a mortar shell through a glass conservatory, and the scandalized whispers that had followed Eleanor from her father's disgrace were nothing compared to the hurricane of gossip, condemnation, and delicious horror that swept through every drawing room, every dinner party, every correspondence between ladies who considered themselves the arbiters of proper conduct. But within the walls of Thornwood Hall, none of it mattered, none of it could penetrate the transformation that began the very morning after Sebastian's proposal, when he appeared at breakfast, not in his study nursing whiskey, as had been his custom for 3 long years, but at the table beside his daughter, asking Charlotte what she wished to do that day, his voice rusty with disuse but determined, and Eleanor watched from the doorway as the child's face bloomed with such astonished joy that it brought tears to her eyes. This small moment that represented everything, the thawing of winter, the first green shoot pushing through frozen ground, the beginning of something that felt like resurrection. The servants noticed it first, the way the Duke began requesting that curtains be opened to let in the pale November light, the way he asked Mrs. Blackwood to arrange for the gardeners to begin clearing the choked flower beds despite the lateness of the season, the way his footsteps echoed through halls that had known only silence, and his voice carried instructions that spoke not of maintenance, but of renewal. And they whispered now not of coldness but of miracles, not of a master retreating from life, but of a man who had somehow found his way back from the dead. Charlotte flourished like a flower, finally given water and sun, her vocabulary expanding daily, as though all the words she had stored during her years of silence now demanded release, and she followed Sebastian everywhere he would allow, chattering about her lessons, about the stories Eleanor read her, about the birds she had seen in the garden, and he listened to every word as though each syllable were precious, as though he were trying to memorize the sound of his daughter's voice to make up for all the years he had let grief deafen him to her need. Eleanor taught him, in those golden weeks of engagement, that love was not the weakness he had believed it to be, not the vulnerability that destroyed, but the strength that rebuilt. She showed him through small gestures, through her patient guidance, through the way she drew him into Charlotte's world without judgment, that opening one's heart did not guarantee devastation, that the walls he had built to protect himself had only succeeded in imprisoning him in a tomb of his own making. Lady Arabella, humiliated and furious, retreated to London, where she spread every poisonous rumour she could manufacture, told anyone who would listen that the Duke had been bewitched by a scheming fortune-hunter, that Eleanor Vance had used her position to seduce a grieving man, that Charlotte was being raised by a woman of questionable morals. But these whispers reached Thornwood Hall as distant thunder, threatening nothing, touching nothing, powerless against the happiness growing within its ancient stones. "I thought I needed an heir to save this estate," Sebastian told Eleanor one evening as they walked through the garden where workers were already preparing beds for spring planting, Charlotte running ahead of them with a freedom she had never before possessed. "But I understand now that what I needed was to be saved from myself, from my guilt, from the frozen wasteland I had made of my existence." Eleanor took his hand, still marveling that she was permitted such intimacy, still half expecting to wake and find it all a dream. "You saved me too, Sebastian. You gave me a home when I had none, a purpose when I had lost everything, a love I never dared imagine I deserved." And as the November wind carried the promise of the winter to come, they stood together in the garden that would bloom again, two people who had found in each other the courage to believe that even the coldest heart could learn to burn. The morning of the wedding dawned in shades of pearl and silver, the December sky heavy with clouds that seemed to hold their breath in anticipation, and the small chapel at Thornwood Hall unused for years, its stone walls having witnessed only dust and silence since the funeral of the late Duchess, had been transformed by hands that worked through love rather than obligation. Every pew adorned with evergreen boughs and winter roses from the garden that Eleanor and Sebastian had restored together, candles flickering in ancient sconces to cast warm golden light across faces that had learned to smile again. And as the hour approached, the servants who had watched this household's resurrection gathered not as staff required to attend, but as witnesses to something they had once believed impossible, the return of joy to a house that had known only sorrow. Eleanor stood before the small mirror in her chamber, her wedding gown simple ivory silk rather than the elaborate confection society would have demanded, and upon her hair she wore not the Ashworth diamonds that tradition dictated, but a crown of winter roses, white and pale pink, woven by Charlotte's small determined fingers that very morning, and she thought of the woman who had arrived at this estate with a single worn trunk, and nothing but desperation in her heart, thought of how far that woman had travelled to reach this moment, and she felt not the nervous terror that brides were supposed to feel, but a profound and settling peace, as though every step of her difficult life had been leading precisely here. Charlotte served as flower girl, her basket filled with dried lavender and rose petals, and when the moment came for her to walk down the aisle of the chapel, she did not scatter the petals silently as she would have done mere months ago, but spoke clearly, reciting a poem she had written herself, her small voice carrying through the sacred space. "Where there was winter, now comes spring. Where there was silence, now I sing. Where there was darkness, now there's light. My papa found love to make things right, and there was not a dry eye among the assembled, not a heart unmoved by this child who had emerged from the prison of her grief to offer blessing upon her father's second chance." Sebastian stood at the altar watching Eleanor approach, and those who had known the cold Duke of Ashworth would not have recognized the man who waited there, his grey eyes bright with unshed tears, his severe features softened by an expression of such naked wonder that it transformed his handsomeness from something forbidding into something beautiful. And when Eleanor reached him, when her hand found his voice emerged rough with emotion as he spoke his vows. "I, Sebastian, take thee, Eleanor, not because I need an heir, not because duty demands it, but because you walked into my darkness and refused to let me remain there. I vow to spend every remaining day of my life worthy of the salvation you have given me." And Eleanor, her own voice steady despite the tears that traced silver paths down her cheeks, answered, "I, Eleanor, take thee, Sebastian, not for your title, not for your wealth, but for the man I found beneath the ice. I vow to keep your heart warm for all the winters yet to come." As the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, as Sebastian kissed Eleanor with a tenderness that belied his reputation for coldness, the clouds that had gathered all morning finally released their burden, and snow began to fall, soft, silent, transforming the grey December world outside the chapel windows into something from a fairy tale, blanketing Thornwood Hall in white, as though nature itself wished to mark this moment, to declare that the estate, which had been frozen in grief, was now frozen only in this perfect, crystalline moment of joy. And the cold Duke burned at last with a warmth that would never again be extinguished. 3 years had passed since that snow-blessed wedding day, 3 years that had transformed Thornwood Hall so completely that visitors who remembered its former desolation would stand in the entrance hall with mouths agape, unable to reconcile their memories of darkness with the warmth that now radiated from every corner of the estate. And on this particular morning in late spring, sunlight streamed through windows that were thrown open to welcome the May breeze, illuminating halls that echoed not with the ghostly silence of grief, but with the thunder of small running feet and the bright peals of children's laughter. As Charlotte, now 10 years old, and growing into a young lady of remarkable intelligence and spirit, chased her younger brother through the corridors, the boy's delighted shrieks rising to the painted ceiling as he fled his sister's pursuit. This was William, heir to the Ashworth title, but more importantly simply Will, a child of nearly 3 years with his father's grey eyes and his mother's warm smile, born of love rather than duty, welcomed not as a solution to an ancient legal requirement, but as the natural flowering of a marriage that had surprised everyone, except perhaps the two hearts that had recognized each other through ice and shadow. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the morning room, her hand resting upon the rounded curve of her belly where a third child grew, watching as Sebastian, for he was Sebastian to her now, had been Sebastian since their wedding night, when he had whispered that no one had called him by his Christian name since childhood, and he wished to hear it from her lips, forever appeared at the end of the corridor, and swept William into his arms, growling like a bear, while the boy screamed with terrified joy. And Charlotte danced around them, demanding that Papa chase her too, and Eleanor thought that if the woman who had arrived at this estate with a single worn trunk could see this moment, she would weep for the impossible beauty of it, for the proof that patience and courage and the willingness to love despite fear could build something stronger than any ancient stone. The servants who had once whispered of the cold Duke now spoke instead of the master who played with his children on the lawn, of the Duchess who remembered every staff member's birthday and treated them as family rather than fixtures, of the household that had become a true home, and Mrs. Blackwood, still presiding over the domestic arrangements with her particular blend of efficiency and warmth, often said to newer staff that she had witnessed a miracle in this house, that she had seen a man return from the dead and a child find her voice, and a woman who had nothing become the heart of everything. Letters arrived regularly now from Eleanor's family. Her father, whose debts Sebastian had quietly paid in full, now lived in a modest but comfortable cottage, and wrote monthly to express his gratitude and his pride in the daughter he had once failed to protect. Her reputation, which Lady Arabella had so viciously attacked, had been publicly restored when the Duke of Ashworth stood before London society and declared that any slight against his wife was a slight against his honour, and one by one, the doors that had closed against Eleanor Vance opened wide for the Duchess of Ashworth, though she found she cared little for society's approval when she had everything that mattered within these walls. The heir to Thornwood Hall existed, the legal requirement fulfilled, the cruel cousin's ambitions thwarted, but as Eleanor watched Sebastian set William down and scoop Charlotte into his arms instead, spinning her until she begged for mercy through her giggles, she understood that the true inheritance being passed down in this house was not a title or an estate, but something far more precious, the knowledge that love, once believed impossible, had proven itself the most powerful force of all, and that a family born from patience and vulnerability and the courage to hope would endure long after the stones of Thornwood Hall had crumbled to dust. Evening descended upon Thornwood Hall in gentle violet shadows, the May twilight lingering as though reluctant to release such a day from its golden grasp. And after the children had been fed and bathed and storied into sleep, William in his nursery with his wooden soldiers standing guard, Charlotte in her chamber that had once been a prison of silence and was now adorned with her own watercolors and the pressed flowers she collected on her walks with Eleanor, Sebastian found himself drawn, as he so often was in the quiet hours, to the library where firelight painted dancing shadows across the spines of 1,000 books, and there he discovered his wife in the very chair where he had once sat nursing whiskey and despair, though she was engaged in far gentler occupation, a book of poetry open in her lap as Charlotte, who had crept from her bed seeking one more story, slept curled against Eleanor's side, her face peaceful in a way that would have seemed impossible to the silent, feral child of 4 years past, and Sebastian stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply watching them, his heart so full that it seemed it must overflow, thinking of how this room had once been his tomb and was now his sanctuary, how the very air that had once tasted of dust and regret now carried the scent of Eleanor's rosewater and the beeswax candles she preferred, and the indefinable sweetness of home. He crossed to them quietly, lifting Charlotte with practiced ease. How natural this had become, this fatherhood that had once terrified him, this tender weight of a sleeping child in his arms, and carried her through the warm corridors to her bed, tucking the covers around her shoulders, pressing a kiss to her forehead, whispering that he loved her as he did every night now, making up for all the nights he had failed to say it, and Charlotte stirred just enough to murmur, "Love you too, Papa," before sinking back into dreams, and he stood there longer than necessary, watching her breathe, marveling at the miracle of her voice, her trust, her healing. When he returned to the library, Eleanor had set aside her book and was gazing into the fire, one hand resting on the swell of their coming child, and she looked up at his entrance with a smile that still, after 3 years of marriage, made his breath catch in his chest, and he settled beside her on the settee, drawing her close, her head finding its natural place against his shoulder as they watched the flames together in comfortable silence. But it was not the heavy silence of grief that had once suffocated this house. It was the full silence of two people who had said everything and yet never tired of each other's presence. "I think of it sometimes," Eleanor said softly, "how close we came to missing this entirely if I had found another position, if you had married Lady Arabella, if Charlotte had never called my name that night, so many moments where our story could have ended differently, or never begun at all." Sebastian tightened his arm around her, pressing his lips to her hair, breathing in the scent that had become synonymous with peace. "I was so determined to remain frozen," he admitted, his voice rough with the memory of who he had been. "I thought the ice protected me. I thought if I never loved again, I could never fail again, never hurt anyone again. I needed an heir to save the estate. That's what I told myself, what I told the solicitor, what I told the world. But Eleanor," he turned her face toward him, cupping her cheek in a hand that had once known only how to push away. "You saved me. Not the heir, not the title, not any of it. You." Eleanor's eyes glistened in the firelight as she reached up to touch his face, the face that had once been so cold, so hollowed by grief, and was now warm with life and love, and all the emotions he had spent 3 years trying to bury. "We saved each other," she said simply, and in those 3 words lay the whole truth of their impossible, improbable, utterly miraculous love story. We saved each other. Dear listener, as the fire burns low and the hour grows late, let us speak now, not of dukes and governesses, not of Thornwood Hall with its transformation from tomb to sanctuary, but of the truth that lives beneath this tale, like roots beneath a winter garden, waiting for warmth, to call it forth into bloom. For the story you have heard is not truly about an estate in 1847, or a child who lost her voice, or a man who built walls of ice around his shattered heart, but about something far more universal, far more urgent, something that lives perhaps in your own chest as you listen to these words in the quiet of your own evening, your own solitude, your own secret hoping. We build such fortresses around ourselves, do we not, when life has taught us that love is synonymous with loss, that vulnerability is merely an invitation to pain, that the safest heart is the one that beats behind iron doors and frozen silence. We learn these lessons early and well, and we become like Sebastian, existing rather than living, going through the motions of our days, while something essential within us starves for connection, for warmth, for the courage to reach out our hands even knowing they might be slapped away. But here is what the cold Duke learned in that library, in that garden, in that nursery where his daughter first spoke again. The walls we build to protect ourselves become the very prisons that destroy us, and the ice we wrap around our wounds does not heal them, but only preserves them, keeps them fresh and aching, ensures that we carry our grief forward, forever unchanged, forever unhealed, forever alone. Love finds cracks in our armor. It does not come through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through small moments of patience, through the willingness to sit in silence beside someone else's pain, through the radical act of seeing another person not as they present themselves, but as they truly are beneath their own defenses. Eleanor did not storm Sebastian's castle or demand his surrender. She simply existed with kindness and intelligence and a refusal to accept that coldness was the whole of him, and in doing so, she became the warmth that melted ice he had believed was permanent as stone. Perhaps you find yourself frozen tonight, encased in winters of your own making, convinced that spring will never come, for you hear this truth and hold it close. Every frozen thing contains within it the memory of warmth, and no winter, however long, however bitter, lasts forever. Or perhaps you love someone who seems lost in their own ice, who pushes you away each time you draw near, whose coldness makes you wonder if there is anything left inside worth reaching for. Have courage, patient heart, for sometimes the ones who seem most unreachable are burning brightest within, waiting for someone brave enough to keep trying, to keep offering warmth even when it seems refused. Patience transforms, vulnerability connects, and love, stubborn, persistent, foolish love, finds a way through every wall we build. Rest now, dear listener, and carry with you this gentle knowing that even the coldest heart can learn to burn again, that healing comes to those who dare to hope, that somewhere in the vast and tender mystery of human connection, there is warmth waiting for you too. Sleep well, and let your own spring begin.